There is a place on Earth where people eat raw meat. Some communities shared wives with visitors, and for months the sun never sets. A giant island, almost completely frozen, larger than Mexico, but with fewer inhabitants than a small village, which today has become one of the most desirable territories on the planet. In this new video from Uncensored World, we travel to Greenland, the largest island in the world. A region without roads, where people travel by plane or helicopter, and which today the powerful want to buy for the treasures hidden beneath its ice. A land of icebergs as tall as skyscrapers with villages that have survived for millennia, living in houses made of ice. Pay attention, because on this journey you will discover what life is really like in Greenland, why everyone wants it, and what its true price might be. Let's get started. Greenland is a huge island located at the northernmost tip of the Earth, in the Arctic Circle, between the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. This vast frozen territory is one of the most unexplored areas, with huge regions covered in ice that have never been set foot on by humans. Its immensity is home to frozen forests, imposing fjords, and an ice sheet that covers almost its entire surface. This is a frozen world, a frozen island. But not just any island, but the largest island in the world and also a world apart. A place as strange as the name that defines it, because this enormous region of the planet has little to do with what its name suggests. The name Greenland comes from the term Grenland, used in Old Norse, and whose modern translation would be Greenland. However, this place has very little green, as today most of Greenland remains covered by ice and snow for most of the year. According to some Norse sagas, there is a little-sighted passage shrouded in mystery, known as the Skarvheim fragment, a text of which few references remain, and whose authenticity is still debated among historians, but which describes a disturbing idea. The name Greenland was not created to reflect the reality of the territory, but to transform it in the minds of those who heard it. A Greenland in name, though white and hostile in reality, conceived as a promise rather than a description. This marketing strategy is attributed to Eric the Red, a Viking navigator as feared as he was cunning. Exiled from Iceland after several violent conflicts, Eric was not only looking for a new home, but also followers willing to accompany him to the end of the known world. To achieve this, he understood something essential. In times of fear and ice, a name can be more powerful than the truth. Calling a frozen island Greenland was perhaps the first great act of persuasion in the history of the Arctic, a name destined to endure for centuries, even though it did not reflect its inhospitable reality at all. And although Greenland is much whiter than green today, as it was in the past, that ancient spell continues to work. Centuries later, it continues to arouse desire, ambition, and curiosity, as if beneath its ice there still beats a promise that the world has not ceased to pursue. Greenland is no longer just an island covered in ice and snow, or a marketing project of the Viking Eric the Red. Its location, in the heart of the Arctic, has made it an increasingly strong point of interest for nations on all continents, explorers, scientists, sailors, and strategists alike. There, where the wide immensity seems infinite, the world has begun to see much more than ice, discovering possibilities that previously existed only on maps and in the imagination of explorers. Something that few people know is that the progressive melting of the Arctic, a result of global warming, is radically transforming this region. The once impenetrable sea ice is retreating, revealing sea routes that could change the way the world trades. And these new sea routes are one of the treasures that the world's powers now want to control. Among these routes, there are several emerging routes, such as the Northwest Passage, which skirts the northern tip of North America and connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific. A central route known as the Transpolar Route is also being explored, which would cross the Arctic from one end to the other, avoiding the territorial waters of coastal states. At the same time, further north and closer to Greenland, other navigation options to Europe and Asia are opening up. But navigating these waters is not as simple as drawing a line on a map. Even if the ice recedes, ships venturing into the Arctic need state-of-the-art technology, reinforced hulls, and extremely accurate navigation systems to avoid disappearing among giant ice blocks that move without warning. In places like the Ilulissat Fjord, huge icebergs the size of skyscrapers constantly break off from the glacier and slowly drift toward the open sea, making navigation a real challenge. These new trade routes could drastically cut travel distances and transport times. For example, the connection between Europe and Asia via the Arctic would reduce kilometers and days of sailing compared to traditional routes such as the Suez or Panama canals. That means lower fuel consumption, lower costs, and faster access to distant markets. And not all the ice is visible on the surface. In areas such as Disco Bay, many sailors describe the unsettling feeling of navigating surrounded by mountains of floating ice, with unpredictable currents and hidden fragments underwater. A miscalculation in these waters can be fatal, even for the most modern ships. And it's not just that these new routes are shorter. Thanks to the melting ice, many of them are navigable for increasingly longer periods of the year, something that was unthinkable just a few decades ago. This change has sparked the interest of countries with huge commercial fleets, such as China, which in recent years has begun to talk about what it calls the Polar Silk Road. This potential sea route, taking advantage of the melting Arctic ice, would connect Asia and Europe more directly, shortening distances and sailing times. In some reports, this idea has also been informally dubbed the Boreal Blue Corridor, an expression that sums up the vision of a new maritime axis crossing the icy waters of the north. However, for this corridor to become a reality, it is not enough for the ice to recede. It is also necessary for naval technology to advance, for ships to be prepared to navigate in extreme conditions, and for international cooperation, or competition, in these waters to become increasingly intense. But it is not only China that is watching closely. Russia also sees the Arctic as a natural maritime highway, investing in infrastructure along the so-called Northern Sea Route, which runs along its Arctic coast and already offers a real alternative to traditional routes for goods bound for Asia, and vice versa. But, as you will see, not all interest revolves around maritime or commercial traffic. Greenland is located at a key point between continents, which also makes it a natural enclave for control, surveillance, and logistics in the Arctic region. This interest is not political or a power struggle. It is also a reflection of a global economy that is increasingly looking north in search of new routes, new possibilities, and new opportunities to connect the world. And as these routes emerge, so does the presence of ships, scientists, and research vessels that would never before have ventured so far. The Arctic is no longer a white desert impossible to cross for modern navigation. It is beginning to be a sea full of movement, activity, and future. In this way, Greenland is no longer simply a remote island. It is a meeting point between extreme nature and the possibilities of the new world that lies ahead. A new world that was always there, hidden under miles of ice, or at least since Greenland was formed as part of the globe. For millennia, this huge frozen island has silently guarded some of the most coveted treasures on the planet, including the so-called rare earths, a set of minerals little known to the general public but absolutely essential to the modern world. Rare earths are not rare because they are scarce, but because they are difficult to extract and process. However, they are essential for manufacturing cell phones, computers, electric car batteries, satellites, and increasingly, for the development of artificial intelligence. Without these minerals, much of the technology we use every day would simply stop working. This is where Greenland is once again arousing the world's interest, as there are significant deposits of these strategic minerals under its frozen soil, which are still largely untapped. As the ice recedes and technology advances, accessing them is becoming increasingly feasible. And in an increasingly digitalized world, whoever controls the supply of rare earths controls, in part, the technological future. From electric vehicles to the servers that support the cloud and artificial intelligence systems, much of modern technology depends on an invisible chain of strategic materials. In the case of Greenland, geological studies point to a particularly significant potential for neodymium, accompanied by other heavy rare earths, such as dysprosium and terbium, which are essential for the manufacture of high-performance magnets. Until recently, these resources remained virtually inaccessible under the ice, but today they are beginning to attract growing interest. In a reality where China controls a large part of the world's supply of rare earths, securing alternative sources has become a priority for other powers. Therefore, in an era dominated by digitalization and artificial intelligence, whoever controls access to minerals such as these not only controls resources, but also the ability to build the technological future. And Greenland, silent and covered in ice, holds beneath its surface some of the most decisive materials of the century that is beginning. For this reason, the United States observes and desires Greenland with particular interest, not only because of its geographical position or its emerging maritime routes, but because securing access to rare earths is key to maintaining leadership in sectors such as artificial intelligence, data centers, renewable energy, and consumer technology. In fact, many of the large data centers that power the cloud and artificial intelligence consume enormous amounts of energy and require components made from these minerals. An interesting fact is that some experts believe that the future of artificial intelligence will not be decided only in laboratories or servers, but also in remote places such as this enormous frozen island, an island where renewable energy is everywhere, and where the subsoil hides the materials needed to build the technology of tomorrow. It is for all these reasons that this place, which for centuries was seen as an inhospitable and isolated land, is beginning to emerge as a silent but fundamental part of the world to come. Something that few people know is that Greenland is not an independent country. Although many are unaware of this immense frozen territory is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, within a special relationship of self-government, which means that Greenland manages many of its internal affairs, but continues to depend economically on Denmark to sustain much of its social system. Contrary to what is often thought, as a country belonging to Denmark, Greenland is not part of the European Union, having left the European community decades ago, although it maintains special agreements and continues to receive economic aid from both Denmark and Europe. This aid is essential for the island and its inhabitants to be able to sustain basic services, infrastructure, and employment in a territory where absolutely everything costs more and everything is more difficult. As you can imagine, Greenland's economy is limited and very specific. Its main source of income is fishing, especially shrimp and Arctic fish, followed by public sector jobs and small local businesses. Among these activities, there is even a job as peculiar as that of iceberg hunters for navigation and ports, people responsible for monitoring, identifying, and warning about large blocks of ice that can endanger ports, shipping routes, or small coastal communities. It is a quiet but essential job in a territory where ice is constantly moving and can become a real threat. Because of this reality, this enormous frozen island could not easily survive without external aid. This reality raises a question that many ask themselves silently, and has a lot to do with the reality of this video. Could Greenland live better under another model of government? Would it be better protected if it received greater external investment? These questions are not statements, but reflections on an island with enormous natural wealth, a very small population, and a reality that is often as extreme as its climate. Daily life in Greenland is marked by the freezing cold. For much of the year, temperatures are extreme, with long, dark, and very harsh winters. The cold is not occasional, but the norm, yet life goes on. The capital of Greenland is called Nuuk. It is a small, colorful, and surprisingly modern city for its surroundings. A significant part of the country's population lives there, surrounded by mountains, sea, and ice, in a landscape that seems frozen in time. One of the most surprising realities, and one that also complicates daily life, is the extreme isolation. Greenland has an area of more than 2 million square kilometers, larger than countries such as Mexico, but with only 57,000 inhabitants. less than cities such as Ibiza. In a territory of this size, there are no roads connecting the cities to each other. Each community lives in virtual isolation, so to get around, strange as it may sound, the population depends on small planes, helicopters, or boats, and in rural areas, on sleds pulled by huskies. This lack of infrastructure is also reflected in medical care. Although there are health centers and some regional hospitals, there is only one truly equipped central hospital, located in the capital, Nuuk, to which the most serious patients must be transferred from anywhere on the island. When an emergency occurs in a remote area, the only option is usually air evacuation, which is dependent on extreme weather, winter darkness, and enormous distances. A transfer that can take hours or even days, in a place where the cold and the weather work against you. That is why living in Greenland means accepting a very specific reality, an immense and beautiful territory, rich in resources but also remote, desolate, and extreme, where help is sometimes as far away as its frozen horizon. And it is precisely this contradiction that makes the economic figure that some countries are willing to pay for this place almost unthinkable. A huge value that you will soon learn about, but only after understanding who the Inuit are and what the territory they inhabit is really like. Because here, nature is not a backdrop, it is the protagonist. The icebergs floating off the Greenland coast can reach over 100 meters in height, comparable in size to multi-story buildings. These are authentic ice skyscrapers that move slowly across the sea, silent, imposing, and as beautiful as they are dangerous. For much of the year, the Greenland sky also offers its inhabitants one of the most impressive spectacles on the planet: the northern lights. Green, violet, and blue lights illuminate the Arctic night and transform the landscape into something almost unreal. And although it may seem contradictory, Greenland is not just ice. In summer, tundras, valleys, and green areas appear and flourish, living up to the name given to it by the ancient Vikings, during a few weeks of almost continuous light, when night disappears completely, a season known as the Polar Day. But to really understand Greenland, we must talk about its people. More than 88% of the population is Inuit, an indigenous Arctic people who have inhabited these lands for thousands of years. The rest of the population is mainly of European origin, especially Danish. The term Eskimo has historically been used by outsiders to refer to these communities, although today it can be considered derogatory. Instead, the term Inuit is what they use to identify themselves, and in their own language it literally means person. And now comes something that almost no one knows. According to the meaning of the word Inuit, it does not define a race, but simply a person. That means that, in a way, you are also Inuit. An Inuit who I hope is surprised right now and enjoying this trip through Greenland. If you're surprised to discover this, now is the best time to give us a like and join Uncensored World. As you can see, we don't make quick videos or repeat what already exists on the internet. Here, we research, travel, and tell you about the world with curiosity and without filters. So activate the bell and be part of this community so you don't miss any of the trips we share every week. Returning to the Inuit, because they are the majority, although Danish is the official language, the most widely spoken language in Greenland is Greenlandic, an Inuit language with multiple dialects. The Inuit arrived in Greenland from Alaska and Siberia thousands of years ago, crossing frozen regions during the last ice age. They learned to survive in one of the most hostile environments on the planet through cooperation, ingenuity, and respect for nature. Traditionally, their diet included raw seal, whale, or fish meat, as they did not have enough wood to cook in their environment. For this reason, other peoples began to refer to them as raw meat eaters, an external label that did not define their culture, but rather their conditions of survival. Even today, many Inuit continue to consume raw meat as part of an ancestral tradition deeply linked to their environment and history. In some Inuit communities, there were cultural practices that are surprising to many today, such as wife sharing, known as tussusisut. It was not a widespread or permanent custom, but rather an exceptional gesture linked to hospitality, survival in an extreme environment, and low population density. These practices were always based on the consent of the people involved and were not part of everyday life in all communities. However, within their traditional context, refusing such an invitation could be interpreted as a lack of respect, not so much towards the couple, but towards the community that offered it as a symbol of trust and alliance. This did not mean that it was impossible to say no, but doing so could upset a delicate social balance in places where cooperation was essential for survival. Therefore, rather than an obligation, it was an implicit social norm that was difficult to circumvent without cultural consequences. There is a Greenlandic saying that sums up this ancestral way of understanding life: "When crows turn white," an expression that is equivalent to saying, "never." A saying that, in the context of these traditions, reflects how, in a world ruled by ice isolation and survival, even what seems impossible could happen. Today, these practices belong almost entirely to the past and are part of the Inuit cultural legacy, rather than modern life in Greenland. But they remain a powerful reflection of the extent to which human culture adapts when living literally depends on others. Another fascinating aspect of Inuit life is their ice houses, the well-known igloos. These structures were not built for aesthetics or as makeshift shelters, but as a clever solution to one of the most extreme environments on the planet. For thousands of years, the Inuit observed their surroundings and learned to use the only material that was always available: snow. Igloos are built with blocks of compacted snow, not solid ice. This snow contains millions of tiny air bubbles trapped inside, which act as a powerful thermal insulator. Thanks to this principle, the cold outside does not penetrate easily, and the heat generated inside is retained surprisingly efficiently. The dome shape of the igloo is no accident. This design distributes weight evenly and reduces the surface area exposed to the wind, making it particularly resistant to storms and extreme cold. In addition, the entrance is usually located at a lower level than the sleeping area, allowing cold air to remain below while warm air accumulates at the top. Inside, the simple body heat of the people, together with small animal fat lamps traditionally used, can raise the temperature significantly. Thus, while temperatures outside can reach close to 50 degrees below zero, inside the igloo, the environment can be maintained around freezing point or even slightly above. This temperature difference, which can exceed 60 degrees Celsius between the inside and outside, makes the igloo a true work of natural engineering. It is a perfect example of how human ingenuity, when observing and understanding nature, can create effective shelters even in the most inhospitable places on the planet. As you can see, everything in Greenland is about adaptation, ingenuity, and survival. And now that you know what life is really like on this frozen island, before we find out what it might be worth, we'd like to ask you, how much do you think Greenland should be worth? If you had all the money in the world, how much would you pay for it? Do you think a country should be able to buy it? Or would you prefer it to remain intact, even if that means relying on external aid? Pause the video and leave us your opinion in the comments. Your answer says much more than you imagine, and it will be great to get an idea of how we all see the world. And now pay attention, because after learning about its life, its people, and its harshness, it's time to talk about numbers, about money, and about how much the most desirable island on the planet could really cost. Putting a price on Greenland is not easy. We are not talking about a house, a company, or a city, but the largest island on Earth, a region with almost infinite resources, human beings, culture, and traditions, infrastructure, sea, ice, and a unique strategic position in the world. However, this is not the first time someone has tried to put a figure on it. The idea of buying Greenland has been on the table for decades. Back in 1946, after World War II, the United States offered Denmark $100 million in gold for the island. Adjusted for today's economy, that offer would be equivalent to approximately $1.3 billion. Denmark immediately rejected the proposal. Decades later, in 2019, the idea resurfaced when the then President of the United States publicly suggested the possibility of buying Greenland. Although many took it as a joke, the debate reopened around the world. How much would this island really be worth if a price were put on everything it contains? To better understand this, some analysts have made historical comparisons. For example, Alaska was purchased by the United States in the 19th century for an amount that would be equivalent to just over $100 million today. Greenland is even larger than Alaska and has resources that were not even known at the time, so its value would be incomparably greater. Modern estimates vary greatly depending on what is taken into account. Some conservative calculations, based solely on territory and population, put Greenland's value at around several tens of billions of dollars. Other broader analyses, which include mineral resources, energy, fresh water, and future shipping routes, raise the figure to hundreds of billions of dollars. If only strategic mineral resources, such as rare earths, critical metals, and potential energy reserves, are considered, some estimates have reached values in excess of $1 trillion. Not because that money will appear tomorrow, but because the resources exist and could be exploited over decades or centuries. To put this into perspective, Greenland's current economy is small. Its gross domestic product is only a few $billion a year, and it depends heavily on external aid, as you have seen on this trip. This shows the enormous difference between what the island produces today and what it could be worth in the future. Another key element is the cost of maintaining Greenland. It is not enough to buy the territory. Enormous amounts of money would have to be invested in infrastructure, public services, healthcare, transportation, defense, and adaptation to extreme weather. Some internal estimates speak of hundreds of billions of additional dollars over time just to sustain this enormous island. There have even been some curious ideas, such as directly compensating the inhabitants with annual payments of several $1,000s per person, which would be a relatively small expense compared to the total value of the territory. But this has never been an official proposal. Today, Denmark allocates a very large amount of money each year to sustain Greenland, demonstrating that living on this island has a constant and high cost, even without exploiting its resources. Added to all this is another key factor. Greenland is not a particularly protected island. Its vastness, low population, and lack of infrastructure make much of its territory difficult to monitor and control. With the accelerated melting of the Arctic, more and more sea routes are ice-free for much of the year, and more ships are sailing these waters that for centuries remained inaccessible. This has aroused the interest of multiple international actors, who no longer just observe Greenland from a distance, but surround it, study it, and traverse it. In a world where control of routes, resources, and strategic positions is increasingly important, this lack of effective protection raises a disturbing question. Could the island and its population be exposed if someone decided to exercise power over it? In this context, the idea of selling Greenland, or at least redefining its status and protection, no longer seems crazy, but has become a complex debate. Perhaps it is not just about money, but about ensuring security, stability, and control in an increasingly competitive world. Added to this is the fact that much of Greenland's value remains potential. Much of its wealth lies beneath miles of ice, in areas without roads, adequate ports, or basic infrastructure. Converting that potential into real wealth would take decades and require colossal investments. In addition, there are very strict environmental constraints. Large-scale oil, gas, and mining operations are restricted, making it even more difficult to calculate its real price and future. Greenland is, at the same time, an immense promise and an enormous responsibility. That is why, when talking about how much the United States or another country might be willing to pay for Greenland, there is no specific fixed figure. We talk about ranges, scenarios, and long-term bets. What seems clear is that any serious offer would have to be at least tens of billions of dollars, and probably much more when you consider the strategic resources and future of the Arctic. And that brings us to the big final question. Do you think Greenland would be better protected and cared for under the control of a major power, with more infrastructure, more investment, and more opportunities for its inhabitants? Or do you think it is best to continue as before, preserving its culture and identity, its nature and its way of life, even if that means limitations and dependence on external aid? Now that you know its people, its harshness, its beauty, and its true value, answer again honestly, even if it's different from your first answer. Would you sell Greenland or protect it as it is? Leave your answer in the comments. As you can see, it may not be the same as the one you would have given at the beginning of the trip, which is why discovering the world with Uncensored World is an experience you shouldn't miss. We hope this trip through Greenland has made you see it with new eyes. If you've made it this far, you're already part of this community and those who enjoy discovering the world in a different way. If you liked it, the best way to support us is to leave us a like and share your opinion in the comments. And now, don't go. The video below continues this journey and will take you to another place in the world where nothing is exactly as it seems. Click, and let's continue discovering the planet together.